For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dominic Golding, so I'm director of what WPI calls the Nantucket Project Centre. So on behalf of WPI and all the students, I'd like to welcome you to the final presentations today. I'm sure most of you have met some, if not all, of the students in their various travels around the island this term. I think we've got a great set of projects that they're going to report on today. I did want to say we've been now going since 2008, and for those of you that don't know the history of the Project Centre, Mike Elms started it in 2008. We had a little bit of a hiatus in 2009 when we took a year off to evaluate how we thought it was going. We thought it was going great, and we've been going at it ever since. As you can see, the number of projects, number of projects has grown a little. We're up to, typically we do 6 projects per year. We're always here in the fall, October, November into mid-December. We typically have 4 students per project, although in the early days we did a lot of projects with 3. So far, we've had 176 students come through, completing 52 projects on the island. So that 176 includes the students who are with us today. We have 24 students here today. We hope that we'll continue to bring 24 students, 6 projects each year for ad infinitum. The projects typically break down into, we do a mix of projects with different organisations. I come over here in May and sort of scurry around and see who might be interested in doing a project. So if you are one of those people that might be interested in doing a project, feel free to grab me at some point during the proceedings today, and I'll be back in May to rustle up projects for next year. But the projects typically break out into we do a lot of projects with the town, as you can see from this figure. About 60% of the projects we've done over the past 9 years have been with various town offices and departments, committees and so forth. We do projects with other NGOs, such as Housing Nantucket, for example, and we do a number of projects in the past with museums. We're always interested in looking for new projects with new organisations. So, as I say, if you know of any people who are interested in doing a project with us, have them get in touch with me. So the schedule for today, we're going to try and stick pretty much to it, because I know some people may come and go for particular presentations. So we've got about a typical 20-minute presentation, followed by about 10 minutes Q&A with the audience. So please feel free to ask questions. My colleague, Rick Vaz, is going to pass around a microphone so we can pick up your questions after the presentations. The whole proceedings are going to be recorded for cable TV, so channel 18, and will be posted. I will send a link on to that presentation probably next week when I know what the URL for that is. So what I would like to do is have Eva, David, Patrick and Corey come up and start the day's proceedings. They've been working on a project looking at re-envisaging the campus for Mariah Mitchell, but I won't steal their thunder. I'll let them tell you about it. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're a team of WPI students that has been working with the Mariah Mitchell Association to enhance the visibility of their organization through wayfinding and identification. My name is Corey O'Malley.
I'm David Cadillac.
I'm Patrick Meehan.
And I'm Eva Barinelli.
So to begin, I'll go over what it means to enhance the visibility of an organization. For our project, we've chosen to focus on visitor wayfinding and organizational identity. Visitor wayfinding is the process of navigating from one location to another, and organizational identification is the process of understanding what an organization does, as well as how its buildings and offerings relate to its mission statement. So as you can see from the table, there's a number of different wayfinding and identification strategies and tools, some of which include signage, pre-arrival technologies such as maps and online websites, place technologies such as QR codes, environmental features such as landscaping, and then support information such as brochures. The MMA is unique in its wayfinding and identification in that it has many different offerings in many different locations. The MMA is a science organization on Nantucket that focuses on aspects such as natural science, astronomy, and historic preservation through hands-on learning, and it has acquired 8 different properties to achieve this goal. As you can see, 2 of these properties are up on Washington Street by the waterfront, and these properties are an aquarium and a lecture hall. In the middle, on Vestal Street, are buildings, and there are 5 buildings, including the administrative offices, the historic Mitchell House, the Vestal Street Observatory, a natural science museum, and then a soon-to-be research center. And finally, down on the Milk Street extension, there's another observatory. Currently, the MMA thinks that visitors struggle to navigate between these different locations, as well as recognizing which locations belong to the MMA and how these locations relate to its offerings and its mission statement of hands-on learning. So to tackle this project, we've developed one major goal and 4 objectives. Our goal was to determine the steps the Mariah Mitchell Association could take to improve its visitor wayfinding and organizational identity. So essentially this meant looking at some of these strategies from the table shown earlier, such as signage, online presence, and brochures to improve these things. First, we looked at wayfinding identification strategies that other organizations have used, specifically those that have proven to be successful. And next, we looked at the perspectives of key stakeholders, particularly those of MMA staff and board members, to understand what they thought the MMA was facing the challenges the MMA was facing in terms of wayfinding and identification, as well as what they thought they could do to address these problems. Then we examined different budget and design constraints, especially the regulatory constraints. Here on Nantucket, there are many different town offices with regulations, such as the Historic District Commission, which places heavy regulations upon signage, which is a very important wayfinding tool. Keeping these constraints, the perspectives of our key stakeholders, as well as the known successful technologies and strategies, we then proposed a set of recommendations for the MMA. To propose this set of recommendations, we went through a series of research methods. First, we conducted site visits in order to understand the current condition of the properties as well as the signage there, and then also understand what it's like to navigate through these properties firsthand. We then conducted interviews with many MMA staff and board members, as well as other cultural organizations on Nantucket, to understand what they've done in the past to address their own wayfinding identification problems, and see which may also apply to the MMA. And finally, we conducted a survey which was sent out to many MMA supporters, such as donors and members, to understand the MMA's main audiences, which location these audiences prefer to visit, as well as the preferred navigation methods of this audience, so whether that was paper maps or digital maps. Now I'll be handing it off to David, who will be talking about our findings and recommendations.
Thank you, Corey. So we'll start by talking about our findings for our project and recommendations for how the MMA can improve. So we'll start off with the branding and logo for the organization. So the MMA currently uses 2 different logos: the old woodcut, which appears primarily on signage, and the modern, more contemporary logo, which appears on the website as well as marketing collateral. Through our interviews with MMA staff, we've determined strengths and weaknesses for each of these logos. The woodcut is aesthetically pleasing. However, it's very difficult to reproduce on print and digital media. The contemporary logo doesn't have these issues. However, it's very bland and doesn't really convey what the organization is all about. It's very clear that using 2 different logos causes a visual disconnect for visitors and can be detrimental to the organization. Therefore, our primary recommendation for this will be to choose one logo and abolish all their uses of other logos throughout the MMA. However, as a long-term solution, we may recommend that the MMA pursue a rebranding process and develop an entirely new logo. We understand this would be a very lengthy and expensive process. However, we also believe it's important for the MMA to have a logo that represents them and that the visitors can relate back to the organization. However, if the MMA were to stick with the contemporary logo, it's important to keep it consistent. The top left was the original version of the logo, while the bottom right is the current version of it. There are various forms of it in marketing collateral, the website, and even the vehicles that the MMA operates, so it's important to keep it consistent, and if the MMA sticks with this logo, we recommend that they choose one version and only use that version. Next, we'll be moving on to the website. We've figured out a couple things that can be improved about the website. First of all, it's not mobile friendly. So if you were to use it on a mobile device, it won't resize, and the navigating to a page that you didn't want to can be frustrating. So it's important, if the MMA revamps their website, that it be made mobile friendly. Next, you may have also noticed that the logo on the website isn't up to date. So once the MMA chooses a logo, it's important to keep it consistent. And also, when discussing with Trinity Foreman, the MMA's executive administrator and marketing event coordinator, she thought the calendar was very important on the website, but currently it's very small. But since it's important for the MMA to have all their events available for the public, she thinks it could be a more prominent feature on the website. Next, we'll be talking about the Google My Map. Currently, it's very simple and has a few pinpoints for each location that the MMA has. But we developed a prototype that has more features that can be very interactive and helpful for guests. So now the pinpoints have a special icon. It tells you which location is at which place. And now if you were to click on, say, the aquarium, you'll get the location name, a description of the location, the address, as well as several photos of a location that will help with finding it, as well as pictures of events that happen there. So it's easier to get intrigued and know what you're getting into when you go to that location. And next, I'll hand it off to Patrick, who will be talking about marketing collateral.
Thank you, David. So currently the MMA has a lot of different flyers for various events and programs that they offer, but they don't have something that covers the whole organization in a concise, overarching brochure. The closest thing they have right now is their summer program book, which is pretty hefty and wouldn't be that great for someone like, say, a day tripper to Nantucket who just wants something to do quickly for part of their afternoon. We've created this mock-up of an overarching brochure with George Donnelly, the MMA's Director of Development and Communications, with input from the MMA staff and board members of what they think is most important to include in an overarching brochure. Most importantly was including pictures of the fun and engaging educational activities that the MMA offers to people. We also thought it was very important to include a history of Mariah Mitchell and the organization as a whole, and most importantly is the map that features pictures of all the locations, as well as an interesting description of the building and what programs are offered there. And we also want to include the address of each building so that someone can just plug that into their phone and easily navigate there. We also got information about the different audiences at each location through our interviews and survey. And this is important because we want to be able to target different audiences with the marketing collateral. For instance, the Natural Science Museum and the aquarium mostly see visitors that are families with small children, whereas the Loins Observatory gets a much more diverse audience with young children and adults. For our overarching brochure, we wanted to focus mainly on showing children engaging in activities because our survey showed that that was the most inclusive group for the buildings. But it's important that the MMA considers targeting all audiences and not just focusing on one, because they do offer programs for both children and adults. When we went to different sites that the MMA owns and operates, we identified Loins Observatory as the location that most needs signage improvement. On the left, you can see the driveway, which doesn't look particularly appealing and welcoming, and it's a little overgrown. On the right is a view of the observatories from across the street. Again, it's overgrown, and way far back from the street is the sign that says Loins Observatory, which is not in the best condition. It's very worn out, and the woodcut logo is washed out, and the trim around the edges is falling off. So we'd think that now is a good time to improve that signage and potentially try to move it a little closer to the street. So we've come up with 3 potential alternatives for the signage at Loins. The first, an ideal option, would be to have a freestanding hanging sign similar to the aquarium. However, the HDC would almost certainly not approve that because it's a freestanding sign. And the only reason the aquarium can have that is because it was grandfathered into the system as it was around before the HDC. Another option that would be suitable but doesn't convey as much information because it would just be a logo is a post sign similar to those used by the land bank that could be placed close to the street. However, the HDC might not approve that because they're typically used for open spaces and where there's not a place like a building or a fence to affix a sign to. And the third option that the HDC would almost certainly approve is rock signage. However, that's uncharacteristic for the MMA. And if someone were to say, go to the Mitchell House and see that sign, and then see a rock sign, they might not recognize that it's part of the same organization just because of how different the two are. The MMA also has a couple bulletin boards downtown, in addition to signage, which Eva will now talk about.
Thank you, Patrick. As you can see, the MMA has 2 public notice boards. The one on the left is by the Civil War Monument, and the one on the right is at the corner of Center Street and Main Street. Our primary recommendation for these bulletin boards is to include a map with pinpoints of all the locations, addresses, and phone numbers. Additionally, we recommend the MMA add their website address because in our survey, many respondents said that they would type in a short web address to gather more information about the organization. We recommend the MMA update these notice boards at least once a week so they remain neat and organized, as well as flyers do not remain up past the event date. The MMA's landscaping varies from facility to facility, and to improve the uniformity of the landscaping, we recommend the MMA implement uniform plantings such as blue flowers, which is blue is their primary logo color, or they could implement milkweed, which is already at many of their locations. If the MMA chooses to go with milkweed, we recommend that they emphasize the importance of it because it can look a little overgrown and unkempt. They can do this by adding a tag on the plant with information, or a small sign on the fence, or an exhibit in Hinchman House, the Natural Science Museum. The MMA could also add benches or picnic tables to their facility property so that visitors know that it is a public place instead of somebody's private backyard. We also recommend the MMA maintain their properties by cutting back the vegetation so that they maintain a clean and crisp look. Over the years, the MMA's social media has been improving, and to make sure that this growth is successful, we recommend that the MMA provide guidelines for their staff with principles and goals, such as a posting schedule, having only one person post, so that all social media platforms remain consistent, as well as using social media to increase awareness of the MMA. When talking with staff and board members, we found that Vestal Street campus was the least visited, compared to the aquarium and Loins Observatory. To increase visitation, we recommend the MMA improve interest. This can be done through a walking tour brochure or brochure coupled with audio recording. The walking tour would start at the aquarium, point A on the map, and guide visitors to point B, the historic Mitchell House. All the blue pinpoints in between are points of interest related to Mariah Mitchell. The MMA could also implement a social media game that would have visitors take pictures at each of their locations, use a specific hashtag, and state something that they learned. This would also increase awareness of the MMA because visitors' followers would see these posts and the fun, engaging, educational activities the MMA has to offer. We would like to thank the Mariah Mitchell Association, Executive Director David Gagnon, and our liaison Jason Figure for their support and feedback throughout the entire project. We would also like to thank MMA staff and board members for participating in our interviews and survey. We would like to thank Harvey Young and Young's Bicycle Shop for their hospitality and providing us with bicycles. We would like to thank Lisa Lazarus and Egan Maritime Institute for providing us with a tour of the Shipwreck and Life-Saving Museum. We would also like to thank Remain Nantucket for providing us with the Greenhound building as a workspace. And finally, we would like to thank our advisors, Dr. Dominic Golding and Dr. Richard Vaz, for their feedback, support, and guidance throughout the entire project. We thank you for your time. This concludes our presentation. Are there any questions?
I don't know if it's a question, it's more of a recommendation. I think that the work you did here was terrific. I really do. I think it was fabulous. You know, there are a lot of museums on the island, and I think they would all benefit from your understanding, whether it be the Nantucket Historical Association, the Lightship Basket Museum. They all suffer from things that you pointed out. Multiple uses of logos, difficulty in finding out where the multiple properties are, those sorts of things. So if there's a way, or I don't know what you do with this, to get it to the other organizations, I'd highly recommend it.
Thank you. It will get posted on the town website and our project. Yeah.
The report will be available on the WPI Gordon Library website.
Right, what I'm saying is that be more proactive, yeah, in letting them know.
Just to follow up on what Randy said, I think what you have here in terms of being proactive is really a template. I mean, I was looking at how you thought the problem through, and my suggestion would be to, I guess it's a suggestion for me to Visitor Services to take that template and say, how can we use this and apply it to some of the other institutions, especially ones that have several properties in several places, so people can find their way around and really see how they can connect the different places in an afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. We are a group of WPI students working with the Nantucket Energy Office on promoting the adoption of solar PV here on Nantucket. Before we begin, just a little bit about ourselves. My name is Zach Boyer. I'm a junior at WPI studying robotics engineering and mechanical engineering.
My name's John Kerwin, and I'm studying electrical and computer engineering.
My name's Connor O'Neill, and I'm majoring in mechanical engineering.
And I'm Nathan Petrowitz, and I'm also majoring in mechanical engineering.
So what we're going to go over today, we're going to talk about how we as residents of Nantucket are going to promote solar PV. We're going to talk about what PV is, why it's needed specifically here on Nantucket, how we as a community will promote it, what we found out through our research, and what we recommend going forward. So starting off, what is PV? PV stands for solar photovoltaic. In particular, it converts sunlight directly to electricity, oftentimes using panels on houses like you see there, directly to an inverter, which pushes the electricity into your meter and then back into the grid. Why is it needed here specifically on Nantucket? As many of you know, 2 undersea cables bring electricity from the mainland onto the island. Currently, if one of those cables were to, say, have a failure, the island would not have enough capacity to continue to provide electricity to everybody else. As you can see by the graph, the peak energy demand each summer has steadily been increasing since 2008, reaching a peak high of 45 megawatts. What that means is at any one given time during the summer, a maximum of 45 megawatts was drawn from the grid. This is an issue because the capacity of one cable and the existing generation on the island can only provide about 46 megawatts at any given point. So if that cable and the existing generation were to fail, the island would experience brownouts and people would lose power for extended periods of time. Also, Nantucket has some of the highest electricity prices in the country. Currently, each watt is about 22 cents per month, compared to the national average of 13 cents. That presents an 8.3 cent increase here on Nantucket. By using solar PV here on the island, we can not only save the environment and use more renewable energy resources, but we can also help decrease the amount of electricity costs that each resident is paying each month. So knowing that, our goal for this project was to assist the Nantucket Energy Office in the promotion of solar PV here on Nantucket. To do this, we identified 3 separate methods and goals that we wanted to complete. The first being identifying opportunities for and barriers against solar PV here on the island. We started out by developing a survey that would gauge public awareness of what solar PV is and whether or not people would like to have it here on the island. We also conducted many interviews with stakeholders in PV, including HDC representatives such as Ray Pohl and John Hedden, in addition to on and off island installation companies such as AxSmart, Sunwind LLC, and Katuitt Solar. We also conducted interviews with many on-island residents who had already installed PV, some of you in the audience, Jack Weinhold, Carrie Hazelgrove. We also wanted to develop determine what the installed capacity here on Nantucket is, how much solar is actually installed on the island. To do this, we consolidated numerous databases, such as the Mass DOER SREC database, which everyone who has PV is automatically enrolled in so that they can sell energy back to the grid and get monthly checks back, in addition to HDC permitting files and inspection files. Again, we conducted interviews to gauge public's experiences with PV and whether or not they enjoyed having their systems. Finally, we wanted to develop new approaches to the promotion of solar PV. We started off by creating an interactive map to house all of this data to show everyone where solar PV was in a visual way on the island, to talk about not only where it was, but how much it cost, what the installed capacity of each of those locations was, and which installer they used. We also created in-depth profiles from our interviews to push back their residents' experiences with solar PV and hopefully show people that it's not as big of a barrier as people initially thought. At this time, I'd like to pass it on to Nate, who's going to talk about our findings.
Thank you, Zach. As I previously mentioned, we distributed a survey to about 1,000 residents. These residents included town workers and mass save initiatives. In the survey, we were gauging public awareness and public knowledge about the topic of solar PV. One of the questions we asked was how concerned people were with certain topics when they would consider installing solar PV. These topics are ranked from most concerning to least concerning, and these include local permitting, finding a trustworthy contractor, the initial cost of the system up front, unsuitable mounting location on their property, whether it be on the roof or on the ground, the efficiency in Nantucket weather, whether or not it being foggy or cloudy affects the generation of the panels, the pace of innovation, if technology is going to update too quickly, and that if I wait to install, I might have a better plan for that, and the maintenance required to update each system. As I said before, due to the respondents from our surveys, the maintenance was the least concerning for people, and the local permitting was the most concerning. In addition to the concerns that people might have when installing solar PV, we wanted to ask what potential benefits people would enjoy through these. And these included battery storage and backup power, innovative technology, people wanting to be on the forefront of the newest technology available, reducing their electric bill, being environmentally responsible, going away from using fossil fuels to renewable energies, their own self-sufficiency, long-term financial investment, whether it reduces your payment of your electric bill over time and the value it adds to your home, and the local benefits being reducing the peak load demand over the summer and helping the environment. One of our best quotes we received was from one of our interviewees, Jack Weinhold, in the audience. And it pretty much sums up what we're trying to prove here, is that trying to dispel the misconceptions that trying to install solar is expensive. It might take a long time. But after every interview we've talked to, it kept coming up that solar PV really is, it's easy, it's quick, and it's not really expensive as you'd think. Through looking through databases and HTC permitting, we found that there are 40 installed systems on the island. They're broken up on the right here, with 30 being residential and 10 commercial. There are 5 systems that are currently being installed right now that will be finished either later this year or early next year. Over time, as you can see with this graph, the number of PV installations per year has increased from around 1 a year for the first 4 years of this to 9 being installed this year. And again, on the right, we have the green bar for 2018, which represents the installations that are currently in the process. Now, to go along with the amount of systems installed on island, this is the total capacity that these systems generate. And to put this into a better relative perspective, this number represents about 3% of the peak demand of energy during the summertime. And our hope is that with increased energy and as energy consumption increases and more people install solar PV, that we can make solar PV a higher percent of that peak generation and reduce the amount of load on the 2 cables. Now I'd like to pass it off to Jack. He's going to talk about it.
All right, thanks, Nate. So we took all this data that we got from interviews, our survey, as well as just talking to different people, stakeholders, and just figuring things out. And we made some tools to assist in the promotion of solar PV on Nantucket and to help the Nantucket Energy Office promote solar PV. So all of that is stored right here on the Nantucket MassGov website. It's fairly simple to get to. You just go to the Government tab and then the Nantucket Energy Office tab right there. That brings you to the Energy Office's page on the MassGov website, and our deliverables are right down there at the bottom. Going to this page, you can see there's a little summary about us and our project and what we've been up to for the past 7 weeks. But really going down, this is our main tool that we developed to assist in the promotion of solar PV and just show people all the systems that are out there. So clicking this maximize button will bring that up. So as you can see on the left, we have all the dates organized from 2007 all the way to 2018, corresponding with the points on the map. We have residential solar PV and then another layer for commercial solar PV, as well as solar hot water. So clicking on the arrow will give you a list of the addresses with all the installed systems on the island. And then once more, clicking on one of those systems, any address or any point on the map will bring you to a more in-depth profile about that location, listing things like the installer they used, as well as the cost per watt, including the address and the installed capacity of that system, as well as a picture up there. So this is really helpful for people to see really how many systems there are on Nantucket and get a gauge for that and just see what installers people used and what capacities the different systems are and whether they're roof mounted or ground mounted. Moving down a little bit farther, we have our owner profiles. So these, we took 3 of our interviews that we thought went very well and developed these owner profiles. So clicking on one of those. So as you can see in the top left corner, you have the address as well as some pictures of the system. In the top left, you have a little summary about the person as well as some specs on their system, such as, again, the installer as well as the system capacity and the price. And then moving to the main section, we really emphasized people's motivation behind installing solar PV, as well as just the general timeline that they went through, just so prospective owners could see, if they were interested in installing, what other people did. In addition to that, we have a little summary about what is solar PV for people who might not know, as well as some extra links you can go check out if you want more information. Under that, some additional information. This is the graph we showed before, just outlining the PV installations per year. We thought this was a great graph because it shows the exponential trends of solar PV systems. And then just below that, this is a great tool. It helps people who are looking to install solar but might not know a lot about the application process, and it just walks them through that general process. So starting with the HDC application all the way to the final HDC inspection and everything in between. This is great because one of the things we identified on our survey was that there's a real misconception about this process and not a lot of people knew about it. And so hopefully outlining this and opening it up to the public, more people will be interested in solar PV. And then lastly, we have a FAQ section down at the bottom. And this is important because you can really find FAQs or frequently asked questions about solar PV on really any website. But what's important about this is it's specific to Nantucket. So going to that, we have questions just talking about, Nantucket's unique climate, as well as the application process and different things you have to go through specific to Nantucket. And so now I'm going to hand it off to Connor to talk about our findings and recommendations.
After learning about the current situation of solar PV on the island of Nantucket, we wanted to leave the town with a set of conclusions and recommendations. Our first conclusion is that the permitting process for the installation of solar PV is difficult for installers and owners. So our first recommendation is that the current application you fill out, which is the first part of getting a system installed, the HDC application is a little difficult to fill out because there's no fields for renewable energies, specifically solar PV. This is an example of the application where someone actually had to cross out skylights and add solar panels in. So this would help the application process go faster. Additionally, we'd like to recommend that the HDC be a little bit more lenient towards systems outside of the historic cores. So we understand that Nantucket, the HDC likes to keep Nantucket historical integrity intact, but being more lenient for systems outside the historic cores would definitely increase the number of installed systems on the island. Next, there's a current set of guidelines for renewable energies and solar PV. These were written in 2009, and after talking with multiple HDC members, none of them knew about its existence. So we'd recommend that they not only update these, but also reconsider some of the guidelines, as a lot of them are recommendations, and it's hard to gauge about how to plan your PV system when there's not set rules. Our next conclusion is for the Nantucket Energy Office, which is continuing to promote the adoption of solar PV on island, in addition to the local solar rebate program. Our first is to take the lead in establishing better communication within the town offices. So this is between the Nantucket Energy Office, the wiring inspector, the building inspector, and the HDC. Currently, there's not a lot of communication between all four, but we'd recommend that increasing this would allow the Nantucket Energy Office to gain more information about PV systems as permits go through the process. Next, we'd ask the Energy Office to utilize the tools that we've created on the website to promote. That we believe that they are good tools for increasing the number of systems on the island. So going forward, we'd recommend that they use this. Finally, we'd like the Nantucket Energy Office to update the interactive map with new PV installations as they come along. So as either the building inspector, wiring inspector, or HDC inspection finishes their process, they'd let the Energy Office know that a system's been completed and it can be updated to the map. If the map is not updated, it becomes a less useful tool, as people don't know the number of current systems and the current situation of PV on the island.
Before we conclude today, we just have a couple of people we'd like to thank. First and foremost, Lauren Sinatra and the Nantucket Energy Office. Thank you for your support and direction, not only with the project, but showing us how to pull HDC and building permits, and just showing us all of the resources that we needed to use for this project. Harvey Young and Young's Bicycle Shop for graciously donating to the entire group bicycles so that we could experience the island, get to and from work every day, and see the beautiful landscape. Jason Finger and the Mariah Mitchell Association for graciously allowing us to stay in their residence up at Bessel Street at Hitchman House and Drake House. Dominic Golding and Richard Voss for reading our papers and pushing us for the last 4 months to become better writers and better researchers, even though we didn't think we needed to be. Remain Nantucket for donating their space then at Greenhound for some of the groups to work. and the Nantucket Shipwreck and Lifesaving Museum for opening their doors during the off-season to teach us a little bit about the history of Nantucket. And then all of those who took the time to speak with us either during the survey or during our interviews. This concludes our presentation. Thank you all for listening. At this time, we welcome any questions.
I was just curious, in your introduction, you'd mentioned the impact of weather conditions in Nantucket on solar energy, and I just wondered if you'd had any findings about our weather here that might affect people's decisions to use alternative energy, especially solar power.
So we have looked into this, and looking at, there's a certain percentage called the capacity factor, which it makes it so you can see what the weather conditions are compared to what a panel is supposed to do, supposed to generate, and what it actually does. And on Nantucket, it is a little less than what it would be on the mainland. But the biggest factor here is that people still are able to generate most, if not all, of the electricity they use in a day with these systems. So although the generation might not be as good as it is on island, people are still able to fully utilize the benefits of solar PV.
Other questions? Okay, here we have one. I've had a request for people to introduce themselves when they ask a question. Peter?
Peter Morrison. I just wanted to point out a very important connection point here that comes out of this study. We all know from our energy bills that close to half of what the bill is the shipping costs for those electrons that we use. And the 800-pound gorilla on the immediate horizon is that third cable that's going to cost $100 million, which is going to keep that pricing program going into the future. We do have a gigantic battery that's going to be put in on Nantucket that's going to push that off into the future. What struck me here was that 3% figure that you showed at the beginning, that the last couple of years, pretty much the last couple of years, we have been able to install solar at a rate that looks like it's about half of what that growth in peak load demand is using. So it looks like we could solve half that problem just by keeping this train going forward. And that's a very important thing to think about when you think about the trade-off between what does it cost to institute this program and keep it growing, as opposed to what is it going to all cost us as ratepayers for that $100 million third cable. And that, in combination with the gigantic battery, I think is a very, very promising approach going forward.
Thank you all so much.
Okay, we're a little ahead of schedule. We may want to take a 5-minute break if anybody needs to run out and use the bathroom whilst we have a few minutes. I had a question from somebody in the audience about what kinds of organizations we will work with in terms of projects. And we basically will work with typically any organization. Most of the projects that we do in the IQP, as it's called, these are projects that are done when the students are juniors, are typically non-profits, government agencies, and the like. There's projects that the students do in their final year are oftentimes done with the private sector. So for the projects that we do on Nantucket, pretty much any non-profit, government agency, and so forth, we're happy to work with. We do like to be able to have the students work closely with the members of whichever organisation is sponsoring the project. So if it's possible to find a spot where students can have office space with their sponsoring organisation, that's the ideal. In the case of Nantucket, it's often difficult to find a spot to put 4 students, so we understand that. We've been very lucky that Remain Nantucket has given us office space for the students to work at out of downtown. But we're happy to entertain project ideas from pretty much any organisation on the island who might be interested.
Dominic had mentioned a little bit earlier that I used to be his colleague in the Interdisciplinary and Global Studies Division. I had the great fun of helping to organize our off-campus project program and be involved with the start of this program and about 25 other programs all around the world. But I wanted to just say a few words about what I'm doing now, because I think it is relevant to what you've been seeing. Across higher education, colleges and universities of all different sizes and shapes are starting to try to figure out how to engage students in this form of experiential learning and how to supplement the learning that students have in their classes with opportunities to apply that knowledge to solve real-world problems working with community organizations, whether it's in the same community where the college or university is, or a community halfway around the world, or an island 30 miles out to sea. WPI launched a year ago the Center for Project-Based Learning. I'm the inaugural director of that center, and we are trying to help other colleges and universities begin programs similar to this to give their students an opportunity to solve community-based problems like the students that you've been seeing here. We've been very gratified by the response to this organization. In less than 2 years, we've worked with almost 90 colleges and universities, some of which come to us for an annual summer institute that we offer at WPI, which is an intensive 3-day program, and others have had us visit them to deliver custom workshops on their campuses. I was in Lima, Peru this summer, delivering a 3-day workshop to the faculty down there. But I just wanted to let you know that the work that WPI has been doing in these project centers for the last 47 years is finally starting to have a little bit of influence in the rest of higher education. And it's really our hope that through this, more students can have these types of experiences where they learn how to work in teams with people that they might have very different backgrounds from. They learn how to do research, they learn how to communicate, and how to write a report, how to give a presentation, how to take advantage of resources. And I like to think that, in particular, when we come to a place like Nantucket, and the students have the opportunity to engage with almost every aspect of a community. They get to meet the selectmen, they get to interact with key town offices, they get to talk to residents, they get to explore all of the different challenges and opportunities of the island. I like to think that it gives them a better sense of how people live in communities, and I like to think it will make them more civically engaged citizens later in their lives. So I think that, are you expecting anybody else beyond the people that we have here? I see that your sponsors are here. All right. Well, take your time, because there may be somebody else coming to see you, and your talk was scheduled at 2 o'clock. But clear your throats.
Analysis prevention is worth a pound of cure. Has 0 hour approaches. Yeah. So I guess we'll just be waiting for 5 minutes while we hit 2 o'clock.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. We are the group that has been working with the Nantucket data platform in an effort to estimate the effective population on Nantucket. So first, I'm just going to go through a brief overview of our presentation today. First, we'll just give an overview of the general problem that we were trying to address, which will really lead us to an introduction to Streetlight, which is the main source of data we're using for our population estimates, which will lead into our actual analyses, and finally, our conclusions and recommendations. As you know, the population on Nantucket greatly varies by season. However, there's not sufficient data on certain population trends, and there's no answers to questions such as what is the summertime population, what categories of people are coming here, and what's the population during certain special events on islands such as Stroll, which is pictured here. And answers to these questions could be greatly beneficial to various organizations on islands such as local government, business, and nonprofit organizations. So thus far, the best insights that we've had into population trends on Nantucket have come from a 2010 study done by a group of WPI students. They looked at solid waste data, which is simply garbage production, which was obtained from the Department of Public Works. And as you can see, it shows that the population in the peak summer months reached upwards of 50,000 people, and this was back in 2008 through 2010. And while this information may be a valid approximation of the population on Nantucket, you cannot really say for sure because there haven't been any population estimates using other data sources. So the Nantucket Data Platform is a venture that was created earlier this year by a group of Nantucket residents with the goal of providing a reservoir of reliable information to the Nantucket community for use in decision making. We have started the Nantucket Data Platform's first project, which is an effective population study, which aims to fuel the platform with information about the population on Nantucket. And we have split the population into 4 broad categories, including permanent residents, commuters, visitors, and seasonal residents. And these 4 categories make up what we will refer to as the effective population of Nantucket. So an outline of our project goals and objectives. First, our overall project goal is to determine methods for estimating the effective population of Nantucket. And to do this, we first researched the best practices that have been used as methods in other communities to estimate the population. And next, we used our methods along with data that we collected from Streetlight, which we will mention later, and we also used other sources as a comparison. And lastly, we evaluated stakeholder needs for population data through a seasonal employment survey, and we also interviewed stakeholders. So when we first arrived on island, we tried to determine what sources of data would be beneficial to look at when estimating the population of Nantucket. First, we looked at direct sources of data, which are simply direct counts of people. And these can be the town clerk street census, which is a count of permanent residents on Nantucket, and ferry and airport travel data, which is the total number of tickets sold for travel to and from the island. And for indirect sources, we looked at sources of data that contain what demographers call symptomatic indicators, and symptomatic indicators simply show people's presence on islands, but they are not direct counts of people. These can be solid waste, which we looked at earlier. It was the garbage production and a study from 2010, and also streetlight mobility data, which Frank will discuss with you now.
Thanks, Tyler. You may be wondering what Streetlight is. Streetlight is a transportation data platform that collects cell phone records and provides it to its clients. It is normally made available to government agencies to create transportation analyses, and the NDP thought it'd be a good idea to use it to estimate the effective population on Nantucket. Streetlight works by taking the location services on your phone, which many apps use, as well as your network providers because you're connecting to their towers. It is anonymized and sent to Streetlight, where it is processed into many usable metrics that its clients can use to perform analyses. One of these metrics is the inferred home and work locations of the cell phone users. Based on Streetlight's own internal grouping of these distances, we decided to go with a 25-mile radius to categorize people on the island. The first is permanent residents. We determined that permanent residents would live and work within 25 miles of the island. The area highlighted in the circle on Martha's Vineyard, we determined was not statistically significant for our total population, and we were safe to assume that it had no effect on the total count. The next category we divided was into visitors. Visitors live and work outside of the 25-mile radius. We made sure that they were far enough away so we could be sure that they are not included in our permanent resident calculation. The third category we broke the population into was commuters. Commuters live between 25 and 50 miles on the island, but they work within 25 miles. We chose 25 to 50 miles as we determined it would be unlikely that anybody would commute farther than 50 miles to the island. Through our use of this Streetlight data platform, we have identified a few key advantages. The first being the ability to infer home and work locations, which is something Nantucket has not had access to before. The next is the demographic information that Streetlight provides on its cell phone users, namely demographic information such as income and education level. Streetlight is also able to separate its data into certain times of day or even days of the week. This way we could be able to see if more visitors come during noon on the weekends or what peak retail hours might look like. Another advantage is Streetlight's own visual data representation software, where we can get at a glance the relative populations of visitors and residents on island. We've also identified a few limitations of this platform. The first being is that due to all the data being anonymous, we could only get averages and relative proportions of the users. We were still able to conduct effective analyses with this data. Streetlight also only captures about 23% of the total cell phone traffic in the nation. Even though this is not 100% of all cell phone traffic, since we are only dealing with the relative proportions, we're able to extrapolate this data into analysis. Streetlight provides its users with data averaged over the entire month. While this is usually okay for on-season population or on-season months when the population activity is relatively constant, this could pose a problem during off-season months such as December when many visitors come during for stroll. Streetlight also takes about 2 months to process the cell phone location data for its clients to use, so we are unable to get real-time data from it. Lastly, using the methods described previously, we were unable to identify seasonal residents. Since this is an important category of residents, we feel that more research may be required. I'll now hand it over to Sam to explain the analysis we performed.
Thank you, Frank. So it's important to understand what an anchor month is, as it's used in all of our calculations to extrapolate for total population on island. So an anchor month is the month where the total population of the people on island most closely resembles the permanent resident population of the island of Nantucket. We then use this month as a basis to extrapolate for every other month of the year. So for this month, we chose February due to the fact that it was the lowest solid waste production of months for our data that we collected about solid waste. We can assume that this means that there's the least amount of visitors on island during this month, which then makes it the month that most closely represents the permanent resident population of the island. Here's how we did the calculation to find the total population on island for the month of February for our anchor. We started with the street census number for the total number of permanent residents, which was 13,200. We then factored in the 77 response rate to extrapolate for those that did not respond to the street census, which gave us our lower bound of 17,000. This lower bound assumes 0 visitors during the month of February. Then we used ridership data from ferries and airports to get a conservative estimate on the number of visitors during the month of February. This gave us our number of 18,600 for our middle estimate. Then we used the percentages we got for streetlight that calculated the percentage of residents on island during the month of February, and this gave us our upper bound of 24,700. We are currently most confident in our middle estimate, as we believe that the upper bound is more than what previous estimates for for total residents on island during the off-season normally is. Here you can see our population estimates based on the solid waste data we had collected. You can see in blue here our anchor months for the month of February, blue being the upper bound, green being the middle estimate, and gray being the lower bound. You can see then these peak numbers for the on-season of 95,000 for our upper bound, 71,000 for our middle estimate, and 65,000 for our lower estimate. Here you can see our calculations using the streetlight data we got based on the percentage of residents. You have, once again, the upper bound in blue, the middle estimate in green, and the lower bound in gray, with the peaks being 75,000 for the upper bound, 55,000 for the middle estimate, and 51,000 for the lower bound. Here you can see a comparison between the middle estimates for solid waste and streetlight data. As you can see, during the off-season, our number of population is quite comparable, but during the on-season, there is quite a large difference. We believe that this could be due to a couple of reasons. One might be that not everyone produces the same amount of solid waste as everyone else. So when visitors come on island, they might produce more waste than residents. And then the other reason might be that streetlight doesn't always track equal percentages of certain demographics. Here you can see using our streetlight heuristics combined with the streetlight middle estimate data, we were able to break it down into demographics. For blue, you see the residents, which remains mostly flat throughout the year, as expected. And then we see a sharp increase of visitors during the on-season for the summer months. And with that also comes an increase in commuters, seen in white here, to deal with the additional population on island for those months. I will now pass it on to Alec for conclusions and recommendations.
Thank you, Sam. So through all of our analyses and the different things that we looked at, we came up with a series of recommendations and conclusions that we'd like to pass on to the NDP to continue with in the future. So the first is the development of our anchor month. We used data that we had access to and it was also current to this time frame, but moving forward we would recommend that they continue to update this number and reanalyze it as new data sources become available and as the population continues to change throughout the years. Next is the weighing of our streetlight categories. Most of our analyses were under the assumption that each of our categories, whether it be permanent residents or visitors and so on, were represented equally. However, we have no current data to support this, and so any data that would be able to scale certain demographics as needed would give a more accurate representation of the population on Nantucket. Third is the continuation of our waste data analysis. We believe that this method is a very secure and promising way to accurately identify people, as most people, when they are on island, are going to produce solid waste in some form or another. And so, again, using both the weighing of categories of people and the continuation to refine our anchor month, we believe that this would be a very promising way to analyze the population on Nantucket. Another is to refine the methods we use to categorize individuals. As Frank mentioned earlier, we are unsuccessful in identifying the seasonal resident population. This is because due to the way we categorize them using this tool, Streetlight, they would either appear in our data as being visitors or permanent residents, simply depending on how long of a time they spent here. So new sources of data would be needed to be collected if we are to successfully identify this group of people. The next is the use of travel data from the Nantucket Airport and the Nantucket ferries to in a way to kind of check to see if the analyses used from other sources of data are accurate, because from our base point in our anchor month, you can see from travel data from these different sources if the number seems to be close as to how many people are actually traveling to and from the island on a per month basis. And lastly, the Nantucket data platform, the main purpose is to be a tool and a utility to the community for uses in decision making and further planning. And so an open channel of communication would be greatly beneficial to maintain as different organizations or different town businesses require certain sets of data. So as mentioned earlier, we conducted a series of interviews with members of the community that might see this platform as being very beneficial to them. And from this, we developed a couple of recommendations for future analyses to be conducted that would greatly benefit a number of individuals. So the first is a traffic pattern analysis on island. This entails looking at the island specifically and using this tool, Streetlight, to analyze what routes people are most popularly taking from point A to point B. This would be greatly beneficial in allocating appropriate funding or planning construction projects accordingly to upgrade certain infrastructures on Nantucket to deal with the increase primarily in the summer. This is also in an attempt to try and relieve congestion in the downtown area during the summer months as well. Another is a traffic by time of day analysis. As Frank talked about, Streetlight can look at specific hours of the day to see where people are moving to and from more precisely. And so using this analysis could lead to the planning of certain bus routes, for example, again, to help relieve congestion in the downtown area, but also allocate funding and planning appropriately throughout Nantucket as is needed. The last would be a visitor origins analysis. Mostly in the private sector, but also a few of the nonprofit organizations on Nantucket spoke about how they would be very interested to learn in where people are coming from, and for the primary purpose of not only promoting business on Nantucket and promoting tourism on Nantucket, but for also promoting the island as a whole as a destination to come and visit, as this is such a remarkable community. Before we wrap up our presentation, we just like to thank a couple of our individuals that have a great impact on us during our time here. The first being the Nantucket Data Platform, in particular, Alan Warden, Peter Morrison, and Joseph Smilowski for all the aid and advice they've given us throughout this project, and what a great help they have been. Second is Catherine Stover, the town clerk, for not only providing us with the street census information, but also helping us to understand how it works and the different caveats that it contains, as this was mostly because this was such a very important and central role in many of our analyses that we conducted. We also like to thank our advisors, Dominic Golding and Richard Vaz, for all of the help and aid that they have given us over the 4-month process that we have been researching this project, and we'd just like to thank them for mainly dealing with us for all that time. We'd also like to thank the Mariah Mitchell Association, Harvey Young's Bite Shop, the Nantucket Shipwreck and Lifesaving Museum, and Remain Nantucket for being such great hosts and aiding to our ability to strive and grow during our stay here on Nantucket. Before we jump into questions, Peter Morrison and Alan Warren from the Nantucket Data Platform have prepared just a brief statement that they'd like to share.
Peter Morrison here. I'm reminded when we first started out the first day, Rick Vaz said, based on a lot of experience, he said, "This is one of the most unusual projects I have ever encountered in my many years running projects all over the world." And I just wanted to say that the way this project has ended has been really just spectacular in terms of the transformative effect it has on how people in my field, demography, think about estimating population using the kinds of information we have available now. Somebody had to take the first step here, and they had to do it in a place that had more problems and more issues than any other place. And this is the place that you guys did it, and I really congratulate you for what you've done. I also wanted to say that the starting point that you've made here with this project, this is going to be a work in progress for several years going forward, long after you've left. And this is going to create an asset that's going to be tremendously valuable for the public sector and the private sector. And I can tell you that you guys are all welcome back here anytime you want to come back. We'd love to have you come back in the summer. Love to have you come back the year after this summer, but I'm told that's impossible because you all have job offers by your the fall of your senior year. So thanks for everything, guys.
All right, at this time, we'd like to open the floor to further questions.
I'm Alan Worden, and I'm the founder of the data platform. I wanted to thank Peter and Joe. Joe Smilowski is the chairman of our advisory board and was the chief data officer at Citigroup, so he actually knows a lot about big data. It's been wildly helpful. And I'm reminded that most Nobel laureates win for work they did in their 20s and 30s. And so part of us said, these are a bunch of undergrads, what do they know about big data? And then another part of us said, let's not be so smart. These guys might be onto something. So this has been wildly helpful. We kept saying, we're giving you a race car that we're still learning to drive, which is the streetlight data. And we have some of the best data analysts in the country and demographers in the country helping us figuring out this effective population study. And I think the work they've done, as Peter said, is a great step forward. And we hope that our data is available to graduate students, undergrads, and even high school students as we move forward. And you guys, this is an incredibly complicated problem that literally no community has solved, which is why Peter's so excited about it. Demographers have not resolved this. The framework was developed 10 years ago, but they didn't have the data. So we took that framework, we have shifted it a little bit to accommodate Nantucket, and we've gathered data that didn't exist. Mobility data didn't exist 3 years ago. So if we can get the best tools and smart framework, and we can seed it with people all the way from undergrads to some of the data analysts, leading data analysts in the country, we may solve something here that hasn't been solved in the country and could be a model. So I want to thank the WPI team. I want to thank Joe and Peter in particular for guiding you. And I do think we will, part of the data platform is not what do we know now, but how can we get better every month? And I think that will continue. We'll get better and better. So you can come back for your 10th anniversary and we'll have a big party. We'll have it solved by then. Thank you.
Yes, I thank you. Just a question. Why didn't you look at school student population when you were putting this together? Because I would think that, there are many other communities in the country that would have, if you have a school population of X, you might have a resident population of Y. Just curious.
So we did look at school enrollment data, and currently for this school year, there are around 1,600 students enrolled on Nantucket. And if we use the national average for it was the state average for Massachusetts we used. And when we scaled this data, it came to about 10,000 people as a permanent population, which we knew to be false because of the fact that there are currently 13,000 over on the street census that Catherine Stover conducts every year. So we found that this set of data just couldn't apply to Nantucket just because of certain unique characteristics of the island.
And what were those unique characteristics that made it so unusual?
We believe that these unique characteristics are due to the fact that it's a tourist and destination area. So across Massachusetts, at least, there are a lot of regular towns, but due to the nature of Nantucket, we believe that there might be per se a greater number of, say, retired individuals that come to retire here and live here. And so that's at least just one of I don't know if you guys have any other caveats, but that was just one of the caveats that we found with that data.
You mentioned in connection with your anchor month that you used waste generation, took that into account. Did you make an adjustment that the last week in February, this is a little bit like rats leaving a sinking ship with school vacation?
Currently, no, we did not. We are unaware of the school vacation time frame, so that was not taken into account.
Okay.
Does Streetlight allow you, I understand that you can't look at specific individuals, but does it allow you to understand what language might be spoken within the demographic to help us understand what our population mix looks like?
Well, Streetlight doesn't have demographic information for what language the user might speak per se, but it does. It can categorize it by race and income and education and a few others. So, not language specifically, but it can track what race the cell phone user is.
If I could just add something to that, Streetlight is a developing platform itself. So they are still working on developing various aspects of the platform. So I wouldn't doubt if they added in various other demographic types of information in the future, as it's a new platform.
Thank you for this great work. I'm curious whether your number is 55,000 or 71,000 or 95,000 for any day in the summer season. That's not the same 95,000 on July 4th as it is on July 13th. Is there any way to measure the unique number of individuals who are visiting our island from the data that sources?
So as it is currently, Streetlight averages over the entire month, but we have gotten notice that Streetlight is going to add a new ability to look at specific dates for analysis. So with this coming out, unfortunately, we haven't been able to look at this ability, but it could be in the future, the NDP could look specifically at looking at holidays or stroll weekend to see the specific spikes in population during those times.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much, team.
Okay. Hello all. Thank you for coming today. We are the Worcester Polytechnic Institute group of students working on novel approaches to parking management on Nantucket.
I'm Shannon Alvarez.
I'm Richard Hosey.
I'm Angela McLeod.
And I'm Nicholas Lanat.
And our sponsors for this project were Mike Burns of the Nantucket Planning Office and Peter Morrison of the Nantucket Civic League. So first, we'd like to provide some context for our project. So a few studies have been done in the past on Nantucket about parking and parking management around 2010-2011. These studies were conducted by independent consulting firms such as Nelson Nygaard and Tetra Tech. And these studies provided insightful information and useful recommendations that are still relevant to the parking situation currently on Nantucket. An interesting finding from the Nelson Nygaard report was that during peak hours of the on-season, parking capacity can reach levels as high as 105%. Ideally, this capacity level would stay more around 85% maximum at any given time. There are a few ways to reach this ideal capacity, such as incentivizing or improving other forms of transportation or just adding more spaces. However, it is the view of multiple professionals, including Donald Shoup, who is the author of the popular book, The High Cost of Free Parking, that the appropriate pricing of parking spaces is the most effective way to reach desired occupancy levels. As seen in this graphic, when parking is underpriced or not priced at all, is when you tend to see these 100% occupancy levels, meaning that most, if not all, spots are occupied during peak hours, causing cars to circle the area until one of these spots opens up. This results in an average of about 3 minutes search time, which doesn't seem like a significant amount to the individual, but when all motorists in the area are considered circling for this amount of time, the resultant traffic and emissions become noticeable problems in the area. This search time additionally would probably be increased in areas such as Nantucket, where traffic flow regulations aren't as strict as the cities this estimate is based off of. However, on the other hand, when parking is priced correctly, ideally 1 out of every 8 spaces would be available at any given time, aligning more with this 85% occupancy level. However, as noted by Shoup, there are a few obstacles in implementing paid parking, such as deciding upon the correct pricing mechanism and overcoming the politics surrounding the matter. This can be especially difficult in areas where people aren't accustomed to paid parking, such as here in Nantucket. So with this, the goal of our project was to evaluate and formulate updated options to manage parking downtown. To do this, we identified updated stakeholder perspectives on the current issues they identify with the system and downtown parking as it is. We also did this with residents through the use of a survey, and then used the feedback and information we gathered from residents and stakeholders to analyze the various factors and facets that contribute to the problem currently, and then formulated shorter and longer term strategies to inform public choices. Additionally, we are completing this project at a very appropriate time as parking matters have recently been on the agenda of the Nantucket Board of Selectmen. And at their November 29th, 2017 meeting, they passed a motion to institute a parking management program, which included action items such as create a Parking and Transportation Commission, a parking benefit district, and a parking fund, as well as engage an independent consultant to design this program. These are definitely positive and important steps to overcome the politics of the matter, as stated earlier, and we hope that our project and other studies will help to inform future decisions made on these matters. Next, Shannon will discuss the findings from our stakeholder interviews.
Thank you. As mentioned before, we interviewed 24 major stakeholders on Nantucket to gain their perspectives, and we began each interview by asking them how they would define the parking problem on Nantucket. Almost all of the stakeholders agreed that there is a problem with parking. However, the differences were in how they define the problem. Many believe that the parking difficulties are limited to the peak summer months, while others believe it extends further into the year. Many stakeholders attributed parking difficulties not only to parking but to congestion as well. Congestion stems from people who avoid sidewalks, ignore designated crosswalks, and cross whenever they please, slowing vehicular traffic to a crawl. This is worsened by the hazardous sidewalks, which are dangerous for pedestrians, and bikers who unlawfully ride on the sidewalks, and which increase congestion and displace pedestrians. Another topic that was brought up frequently during interviews was the attitude and culture surrounding parking and cars in general. This being that people are too attached to their cars and want to be parked as close to them as possible. Many are reluctant to walk or bike into downtown due to the poor conditions of the sidewalks and bike paths, and prefer the convenience of having their car parked as close to them as possible. Also, many are disinterested in taking public transportation due to the wait associated with catching a bus or waiting to get into downtown. Many stakeholders brought up that an increase in enforcement would cause greater turnover. Parking turnover, which affects downtown merchants, is worsened during the peak summer month, during rainy summer days when people prefer downtown activities instead of going to the beaches. Many stakeholders acknowledged that the summer specials sometimes have a lot of responsibilities and parking becomes a lower priority, which causes an inconsistency in ticketing. Some stakeholders suggested having increased penalties such as compounding tickets for people who exceed time limits. Many downtown businesses do not provide parking for their employees, forcing them to take on-street customer parking. Some stakeholders indicated having a designated area for employees to park with a shuttle would be helpful in providing more customer parking on the streets. Currently, some businesses pay for their employee parking tickets or have an employee leave the office and move everyone's cars and see it as merely a hidden cost of doing business downtown. Additionally, with the construction boom in the last few years, many contractor vehicles take up spots in the downtown area, which is especially noticeable in the evenings when the contractors park their trucks in public lots and leave for the evening. One stakeholder suggested in an interview to divert contractor vehicles to a satellite lot with a designated shuttle, which corresponds with the ferry times. Lastly, the proposed intermodal transportation hub was brought up, which the support for this construction is currently split. Many people believe
that it will be a waste of waterfront property or will tarnish the historic aesthetic of downtown, while others are in favor and think that it will divert pedestrian traffic and centralize many modes of public transportation. However, in order for this to be effective, the issues with on-street parking need to be addressed and paid parking would need to be implemented, or else people would prefer to continue to circle for on-street parking instead of paying in a garage. Now Richard will talk about our survey results.
Thank you, Shannon. As Angela mentioned previously, we conducted a survey in collaboration with the Nantucket Planning Office and the Civic League. This survey was designed to get a better idea of public or resident parking needs and behavior, as well as some information on paid parking. So we distributed our survey amongst 25 homeowners associations, and in addition to a list of about 300 civically engaged residents. These are residents that have been involved in Civic League events in the past and tend to be interested in helping out in the community. Many of our responses are from Nantucket, Tom Nevers, Mid-Island, and Pocomo. The 73 other respondents are about a dozen or less respondents from the remaining other homeowners associations. It's worth noting that due to the large response rate of Nantucket, some of our results may be somewhat swayed towards Nantucket. In the question we ask about paid parking, we asked residents to indicate whether they prefer a one-time annual fee or an hourly rate to pay for parking. This 7% response rate are people that decided not to answer the question, presumably because they did not like either option or just didn't like the question in general. Early in the survey, we asked how often people park downtown, and with that information and this information, we know that one-time fee advocates tend to park several times a week or even daily, whereas people who park once a week or less tended to favor an hourly rate. The a one-time annual fee that we mentioned in the last question would most likely be a downtown parking permit. If this permit were put into place, the time restrictions would still be in place, so the parking management would be about the same. However, we calculated that if the permit were priced at about $50 and it was purchased for 21,000 cars, it would generate $1 million in revenue. And if you add this to the revenue from existing permits, such as residential parking permits and projected ticket revenue, it would generate $1.4 million annually. With all this revenue that that's hypothetical and we talked to the survey respondents about, we asked them to rank what they would like to see the revenue go into. The first, second, and third priorities were increasing shuttle bus services, developing satellite lots, and paving and improving bike paths. Those two favored options, they're very connected as they make up a park and ride system. So if you would increase satellite lot capacity or increase the number of satellite lots, you'd also need to increase the number of shuttle buses in order to accommodate the increased volume. This might be an indication that more people want to see park and ride systems as an alternative to parking downtown. However, when we saw that 49% wanted increased shuttle bus services, only 25% stated they would be willing to ride a shuttle bus. This is something we've heard quite often this term. It's that people, it's the idea that some residents want park and ride systems for visitors to use, but not necessarily themselves. Although, at the end of our survey, when we asked for any comments, people listed that they would be more willing if the shuttle buses were more frequent, so more frequent than 15 minutes per se, or the satellite lots were closer to downtown. Next, I'll be handing it to Nick, who'll be talking about our conclusions and recommendations.
Thank you, Richard. So we have made 3 conclusions about the downtown parking situation. The first is that there is insufficient turnover of the parking spots downtown. This leads to increased congestion due to the amount of cars that are circling the area waiting for somebody to leave. Part of this problem is that the downtown employees take up some of these spots all day long, and they either pay off the parking ticket or they move the car every few hours. This, combined with the large amount of pedestrian traffic in the summer, tends to have cars move at a crawl. So it's very time consuming and difficult to find a spot. Our second conclusion is that there is it is necessary to implement paid parking in order to adequately control parking demand. The town selectmen, as well as the town selectmen, are moving towards paid parking, and we have found no significant opposition in our survey or interviews, as long as the funding goes toward improvements to infrastructure or transportation. And lastly, we found that it is difficult to alter parking behavior. Many residents and visitors are attached to their cars, meaning that they are unwilling to use other modes of transportation. The downtown area was not meant to accommodate as many vehicles as it sees today, so changing this mindset is essential to a solution to the problem. We have come up with recommendations for near-term actions as well as mid- and long-term strategies that will build towards a comprehensive parking management system with the goal to mitigate the problems we have identified as much as possible. In the near term, we recommend that the town implement a parking sticker as well as a parking benefits district. The parking benefits district would be the area outlined in yellow on the map, and it would control all of the revenue generated from the parking sticker, parking tickets, and other parking permits downtown. And it would put the money back into the area for transportation and infrastructure improvements. We would recommend that the most funding would be put towards satellite lots, shuttle buses, and valet services. We'd also recommend that the shuttle buses accommodate downtown employees so that they are more likely to use that rather than bring their car downtown, as it would relieve the area of their car, and they also wouldn't have to worry so much about paying the ticket or moving their car around. We'd also recommend that the valet services be utilized by town employees that frequently need to travel in and out of town, as many have expressed how difficult it is to find a spot once they return from a meeting. Our medium-term recommendations are to replace the parking sticker with an RFID tag, which is similar to an Easy Pass, or use some other technology that is able to identify individual cars on the street. This technology would be used to implement demand-driven hourly rate pricing, which is more effective at controlling parking demand without the need to install parking meters on the street. The demand-driven pricing would better control demand by setting areas of high demand to a higher hourly rate than areas of low demand, so that parking is better distributed throughout downtown, and it would also incentivize the use of other modes of transportation. Our long-term recommendation is that the town accept a proposal for an intermodal transportation center. In addition to adding parking capacity, the transportation center would be the first stop for visitors getting off the ferry, and it would provide a centralized location for other modes of transportation, which they would hopefully use instead of bringing their car over to the island. We'd also recommend that the town look into installing on-street sensors that are able to gather real-time traffic flow data, collect parking fees, and also alert authorities to parking violations so that the system is better automated. The data gathered and the revenue generated should be enough to allow the town to continuously update and maintain their system. Before we end our presentation, we would like to thank our project sponsors and their organizations, which would be Mike Burns of the Nantucket Planning Office and Peter Morrison of the Nantucket Civic League. We'd like to thank all of those who participated in our interviews and surveys. We'd also like to thank the Mariah Mitchell Association for their hospitality, Young's Bike Shop, Remain Nantucket, and the Shipwreck Museum for their generosity. We originally were going to thank our advisors, but they said that we didn't have to since they were getting paid for this. And lastly, we'd like to thank all of you for attending our presentation. Are there any questions?
Not enough. What grade did you want? Any questions? No problems with parking in town?
Well, it's definitely fun working with this team. You did a great job. I don't think the stats and stuff that you showed in the presentation are really representative of how much and how thorough the research went and how much material they actually developed. My question is simply, do you think going through this effort, I don't think maybe a lot of you were parking aficionados before the project. Do you think it impacted your behavior at all, or your willingness to educate other people of this issue? Do you have any commentary on how it might have impacted maybe your future actions and mode choices?
Well, we definitely had a lot of casual conversations with people around town when they asked why we're here, what project, when we said we were doing a project and parking, they definitely gave us their views on it. And so we learned a lot in that way. But I think personally, especially being over here on a bike more so than driving, I've appreciated thinking about taking those other forms of transportation, because I personally am one of those people who's very attached to their car. And I think it will definitely affect even on campus. Like sometimes I would drive closer to campus to park just for that convenience of having it right there. But I think I'll probably walk after this for sure.
I think that where I live, there's typically not a problem with finding a parking spot. So I don't think I'll be driving my car less, but around campus, I usually like to walk. So if anything, it'll make me more aware of if there's like a parking lot that I'm going to where it's congested. I might think about how they can solve it. So are there any other questions?
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Rachel Hobart. I work at Remain, and I think about parking more than I ever thought I would in my life. I was curious about the sensors and our historic downtown, and if you did any research on specifically sensors that might work given the cobblestones and the granite curbing and things like that, because that was an intriguing idea.
So we've looked at a few sensors. And the recommendation we have would be for years ahead. So like these sensors could advance even further. But right now we think that a sensor like this, where this would be some sort of sensor attached to a light pole or a building, it would be able to detect cars and detect open spaces, also track cars as they drive by. And they're fairly small and unnoticeable. And with further advances in technology, the cobblestone roads and brick sidewalks shouldn't affect their capability.
Any other questions? You can see they've got a lot of backup information here. All right. Thank you very much, team.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are the WPI team working with the Town Manager's Office on improving parks and recreation management. I'm Jessica Greenleaf.
I'm Jocelyn Abdella. I'm Brianna Burke.
And I'm John Loftus.
Our sponsor liaisons for this project were Greg Tivnan, who's the Assistant Town Manager, and Janet Schulte, who's the Director of the Department of Culture and Tourism. We'd like to begin by giving some national context here. So Parks and Recreation is an important aspect of communities all across the country. And as you can see here, community members also approve of Parks and Recreation. So 99% of local government officials think that their communities directly benefit from Parks and Recreation. And 92% of community members also agree that Parks and Recreation is an important aspect of their communities and important local government service. Financially, 83% of officials agree that Parks and Recreation is well worth the investment. However, it's still the #1 recipient of budget cuts in times of financial cutbacks. So Brianna is going to elaborate on how this affects Nantucket.
So although Nantucket is separated from the mainland, it is not separated from the trials that Parks and Recreation faces on the mainland. In fact, these are somewhat compounded by the boom of tourism in the summer, who use the parks and beaches and cause there to be more need there. Because of budget cutbacks and departmental consolidations that happened in 2011, the Department of Public Works absorbed many of the responsibilities of the Parks and Rec department. Through time, some of these responsibilities have gone on to other departments, which we will elaborate on further later, but it has made the Parks and Recreation system a one with many different aspects to it. So our major goal for this project was to provide the town of Nantucket with recommendations to improve management of parks and recreational facilities and the overall picture. Our first objective was to identify best practices in local communities similar to Nantucket, like Tisbury, Massachusetts, which has the Department of Public Works take care of all parks and recreational needs, similar to what the town of Nantucket did in 2011. We also looked into the town of Sandwich, where the Department of Public Works takes care of all the maintenance of parks, and recreation is handled by another department. We also looked into national recommendations of suggested best practices to see what would fit the needs of Nantucket best. We then developed a historical timeline and interactive map to provide the town and its citizens with resources to see where parks and recreation has come, where it is today, as well as what parcels of land are owned by which entities and where collaboration is. We then delved further into those entities and looked at the roles and responsibilities of governmental organizations, quasi-governmental organizations, and others on the island, seeing where relationships were and how those worked. We then reviewed the Parks and Recreation Commission's current workings, what legislation they had to guide them, and what their roles and responsibilities were, and how that fit into the larger picture of Nantucket town government. Finally, we developed guiding material for the Commission by grouping together all the legislation that guides the Parks and Recreation Commission and providing them with some resources that we created. And to delve into the history of Parks and Recreation, I'll hand it back off to Jessica.
So to understand how the current roles and responsibilities are distributed among different entities in Nantucket, it's really important to understand the history of Parks and Recreation on the island. So this begins in 1960, when the Parks and Recreation Commission was first established at the annual town meeting. In 1962 and 1963, the Commission was tasked with building a playground at Children's Beach and given jurisdiction of the tennis courts at Jetties Beach. However, in 1965, the Parks and Recreation Commission was actually eliminated when the town made a Board of Public Works that had the same powers and responsibilities that a Parks and Recreation Commission already had. It wasn't until 1987 that the Parks and Rec Commission was reestablished at the annual town meeting, and by 1989, there was already the first director of the Parks and Recreation Department had been hired. So by then, there was both officially a commission and a department that worked as one entity. In 1992, the town leased the area of Tom Nevers Park to the Parks and Recreation Commission for the purpose of making improvements and providing renovations. In 1997, however, this lease expired and authority returned back to the Board of Selectmen. In 2004, the Nantucket Memorial Airport signed a lease with the town, leasing them Delta Fields for the purpose of recreational purposes as well. And then in 2011, like Brianna mentioned, the Parks and Recreation Department was dissolved and its responsibilities were consolidated into the DPW. In 2014, the lease with the airport for Delta Fields expired and was not renewed. And then between 2013 and 2015, many different parks and recreation responsibilities were distributed out of the DPW and amongst different entities to better match roles and responsibilities of those entities. So Jocelyn will elaborate now on the current distribution of those responsibilities.
As we stated before, initially all responsibilities were placed under the Department of Public Works. Of all those responsibilities, the only one to remain, in red all the way to the left, is the Parks and Recreation Facility Maintenance. This is due to the fact that it was already similar to what they were doing. They were maintaining public property. Now, next over, lifeguards. They went under the Harbor Master due to the nautical nature of lifeguarding, and in green, special events permitting went under the licensing office. Both the licensing office and Harbor Master are under the police department, so those two are kind of grouped together but distinct enough to state. The Administrative Commission responsibilities in blue had kind of an interesting pathway. First, they went to Culture and Tourism after leaving the DPW. Then it was transferred to the Special Events Coordinator. And currently, it is also in the licensing office, although it hasn't really quite settled yet. The programming of Children's Beach has gone from the DPW to the Department of Culture and Tourism due to the fact that Children's Beach and Jetties Beach are both tourist attractions, so it fits under their purview. The 4th of July fireworks involve also tourism, so before going to the Department of Culture and Tourism, they stopped in the Chamber of Commerce. And finally, the programming of several fields, including Nobadeer and Delta Fields, and the Jetties Beach tennis courts, went to the Nantucket Community School due to the fact that they were already programming sports activities. So, there's a lot of people involved, and there isn't always collaboration between the entities, though. So this is Myakomet Beach, separated into east and west. Green is land bank owned property, and orange is town owned property. As you can see, this one facility considered is actually owned by 2 separate entities, and there is not much collaboration between the 2 of them. It's pretty much just they're responsible for their land. And the issue that has come up of this is when the land bank has different requirements for how the land is treated than the town. They both have different approaches. So for someone who parks in the red circled area, they have to cross land bank land before crossing it over into town land. This causes an issue if they are transporting things on wheeled vehicles because land bank does not allow wheeled vehicles over their land. So they have to carry it over the green before reaching town land. So when entities do work together, there's sometimes some problems with the documentation. A lot of working together actually is kind of unwritten or unspoken. For example, lifeguards are provided by the town, but it's not really written down anywhere that it's the town's duty to provide them, nor is it required for the DPW to pick up trash, which is another thing the group does. Sometimes these memorandums of understanding have incorrect information in them. This one between the town and the community school feature some misrepresentation of ownership. The park and playing fields, Delta Fields playing fields, actually belongs to the Nantucket Memorial Airport, not the town. And the Nobadeer Farm Roads playing fields belong to the land bank, but both are listed as town-owned parks playing fields. Another issue is falling behind on documentation. This is an agreement between the airport for lease of Delta Fields to the town, and it expired in 2014 and has not yet been renewed. It is under progress, though. Now, to pass it over to Jess for more explanation on how recreation programming works.
Thank you. So as responsibilities were being redistributed out of the Department of Public Works, it was decided that the Department of Culture and Tourism should take over recreation programming at Children's Beach and Jetties Beach, as Jocelyn said, because they are popular tourist destinations and popular beaches for tourists. So the funding for these programs and for the 4th of July festivities all come out of line items within the Department of Culture and Tourism's annual budget. During the same time period, it was decided that the Nantucket Community School would take over recreation programming at Delta Fields, Nobadeer Farm Fields, Winter Park, the Jetties Beach tennis courts, and at Tom Nevers Park. So the funding for these programs comes out of a revolving fund, and the community school is allowed to keep the revenue from the programs that it holds on these locations in exchange for a yearly $1,000 field usage fee paid to the town. Regardless of the entity in charge of recreation programming at any facility, the town's licensing office is the one in charge of all special events permitting. So a special event is any time that there's an event on public land that involves more than 250 people, involves alcohol, or involves entertainment. So the process for getting these kinds of things approved goes through the licensing office, where one needs to fill out a special events application first. Then the licensing agent has regular meetings with the other entities involved in the logistics of holding special events, where they discuss discuss the applications and proposals before them and decide whether or not it's logistically feasible to have these events. So once they have that discussion, then the person applying receives the licensing office approval. However, the Parks and Recreation Commission has retained some authority on the basis of past practice for specific locations, including Tom Nevers Park, Children's Beach, and Jetty's Beach, which are already under the authority of different entities. Because of this, their role in these properties has become one of events and program approval, which includes special events. So if someone wants to hold a special event on one of the properties that's deemed to be under the Parks and Recreation Commission's authority, they have to go through a completely separate special events application process. So they fill out a separate application specific to the commission, then have to give a presentation at the a Parks and Recreation Commission's meeting. And then after that, the commission decides whether or not to approve that event. So it's not until the person has both approval from the licensing office and the Parks and Recreation Commission that they can actually go through with having this special event. So aside from creating redundancy in the process for people applying for these special events, issues also arise when one entity approves an event that the other does not. So John is going to further elaborate on the Parks and Recreation Commission's role.
Thanks, Jess. The Parks and Recreation Commission was first established in 1960 and then enacted again in 1987. We found no centralized legislation concerning the Parks and Recreation's roles and responsibilities. We also found no transition documentation for new members of the Parks and Recreation Commission. On the town's website, the Parks and Recreation Commission's mission states that the commission can make recreation-related policy. However, consulting town officials and legislation, we found that the Parks and Recreation Commission cannot make recreation-related policy. Also, we witnessed and identified instances where the Parks and Recreation Commission enters into spoken agreements. The problem with spoken agreements is spoken agreements can be construed by the public as formal contracts. What the Parks and Recreation Commission can do, we found, is make Parks and Recreation related recommendations and write grant applications. We also found private citizen efforts to improve parks and recreation facilities. One example is Tom Nevers. Locals are looking to re-amp this area. A community work group has started that completed a site analysis and started a public service survey. Other community members have filed for a Parks and Recreation nonprofit. Well, some community members imagine the Parks and Recreation Commission embodying a conservancy similar to the New York Central Park Conservancy.
All right, so to frame our conclusions and recommendations, we'd like to point out a large conclusion that we made is that the end user is not presenting major complaints about the services they're being provided with in regards to Parks and Recreation on Nantucket. So our recommendations are rather to aim to improve a working system rather than fix a broken one. Our first conclusion is that the parks are being adequately maintained by the Department of Public Works. However, there's no long-term plans for Parks and Recreation improvements on a larger scale, even though there's a recognized need for that. Therefore, we recommend that the town look into the development of a master plan for Parks and Recreation on Nantucket, keeping in mind future maintenance needs as well as the needs of future users. We also conclude that there's no clear centralized documentation for the Parks and Recreation Commission to reference. So we recommend that the town reevaluate and create a new mission for the Parks and Recreation Commission that represents what the legislation says. We also recommend that they look into completing work on a manual, as well as use a white paper as a transition and reference document that we will provide. And to present the next two conclusions will be John.
So our third conclusion is there's no centralized inventory of parks and recreation facilities. First, we would like to recommend that the town regularly publish open space report. The Plus office is in charge of drafting and publicizing an open space report for the town. The open space report can be vital in applying for grants for parks and recreation funding. Secondly, we developed a beaches, parks, and recreation map. That map was compiled from emergency access points, the town GIS system, and the old beaches and parks map. Each geopoint on the map lists public accommodations, a recreation contact, and very importantly, the current owner of that facility. We recommend the town embed our map in the town's website under Parks and Recreation. We think it's a good asset for tourists and the town of Nantucket. But we also recommend the map be regularly updated when facilities change. Our final conclusion is there's inadequate documentation of agreements between towns and other entities. First, we want to recommend that the town legally and formally document all agreements. We want to stray away from spoken agreements. And we also recommend that the town regularly renew all agreements they have with those parties and entities. Oh, so we'd like to thank a few people. Greg Tivnan, Janet Schulte, of course, the Mariah Mitchell Association for housing us, Harvey Young for generously providing us with transportation, the Nantucket Shipwreck and Lifesaving Museum, and Remain Nantucket for their generosity. And we would like to thank everybody we interviewed over the last 7 weeks. Does anybody have any questions?
Any questions?
When you started your presentation and you were showing how things were sort of disjointed in terms of the way that the structure of the organization worked, when you went to other towns, you mentioned Sandwich and somebody else. I didn't hear who that was.
Tisbury.
That was Tisbury, Massachusetts.
So Tisbury and Sandwich. Was it a similar disjointed structure, or was theirs more formal?
So when we were looking into those different towns, we spoke with officials in the Recreation Department for Sandwich and the Department of Public Works for Tisbury. We did not do the extensive research that we did on Nantucket into different quasi-governmental entities and like the Land Bank and Conservation Foundation and groups like that. So as for the disjointedness, I couldn't speak to that.
I didn't know whether you were giving us a free pass, that we were really a mess. And then at the end,
Did we say how to set up?
It's really not broken. Nobody seems to be complaining. I didn't know whether you were giving us a free pass or whether you should have been a little tougher.
Well, to clarify, the people who aren't complaining are the end users. We heard plenty of complaints amongst the many people we interviewed who are part of the management system here. So people within the management system don't like how disjointed it is. The end user doesn't see any, no issues are coming through from that though, which is the good part. So that's why we say that the system isn't broken. We just want to help improve it, for everyone who's actually within the system.
Other questions? All right. Thank you very much, team. All right, we're just about ready to get underway.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to our presentations. We're the team building a food asset map to analyze Nantucket's food system, working with Sustainable Nantucket, Nantucket Food Pantry, and Food Rescue Nantucket. I'm Michaela Dunbar.
And I'm Caitlin Burke.
I'm Rachel Leah.
And I'm Jonathan Gironville.
Sustainable Nantucket promotes sustainable agriculture to protect the environment while improving the island's self-reliance. Nantucket Food Pantry provides vital support to food insecure families and individuals, and Food Rescue Nantucket aims to reduce food waste. These three organizations are working together on a comprehensive food system assessment to increase Nantucket's sustainability, increase food production, and decrease overall food waste. The first step of this comprehensive food system assessment is to analyze Nantucket's current resources through the use of the food asset map. A food asset is a location where a community grows, prepares, shares, buys, receives, or learns about food. I'll give you a brief overview of our presentation. We're going to go into a background on sustainability in Nantucket, go through our approach of creating the food asset map, then give our analysis and recommendations for each stage of the food cycle: production, distribution, consumption, and waste. Give improvements to current food-focused programs, as well as explain our strategy to keep the map up to date. A local food system cycle is defined as the steps food takes from soil to soil, the main stages being production, distribution, consumption, and waste. Starting at the top, moving clockwise, food is grown and harvested. There's potential for food to fall on the ground here and not be included in the harvest. And then food becomes packaged, processed, and distributed. Food can be damaged here and often go bad due to fungi, diseases, and pests. As well as when food reaches the shelves of grocery stores, it's often deemed not aesthetically pleasing or isn't sold by the best buy date. And we as Americans throw away a quarter of our food out each year. As you can see, there's a lot of inefficiencies in our food system cycle. In 1850, there were over 100 farms on the island. However, with the decline of the whaling industry, Nantucket's population and number of farms decreased drastically. Now, less than 1% of Nantucket's land is agricultural. This is a town GIS map for land use in Nantucket. The light green areas depicting agriculture. The black circle here shows the largest concentration of agriculture on the island. This includes Bartlett's Farm, which is 125 acres. And the areas bordered in orange are the Milestone and windswept cranberry bogs, totaling 250 acres. Our approach to creating the food asset map involved 5 objectives. Our first objective was to analyze and evaluate the best practices in creating the food asset map. We accomplished this through background research as well as interviews with stakeholders such as Jesse Belloff from the Nantucket Island Land Bank, GIS specialist Jamie Harding from the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, as well as Jeff Carlson from the Natural Resources Department. Our second objective was to clarify map details such as content and format, and we did this through various sponsor discussions, individually and in groups. Our third objective was to create the mapping database. We did this through gathering information from various public sources, as well as administering a restaurant survey. We then compiled this information into our database, moved it online through ArcGIS Online to create the map. Our fourth objective was to analyze Nantucket's food system through this map. We identified areas where food waste was occurring, as well as improvements in current food-focused programs. Our fifth and final objective was to develop a strategy to keep the map current. We created a user manual detailing how to update the mapping database, as well as implementing a program with interested high school students and advisors in order to update our map annually. I'll now pass it off to Caitlin, and she'll explain some of our map and our analysis behind it.
Thank you, Michaela. The map created contains Nantucket's food assets in various data layers. These are shown on the right of the image and listed out. If you select different data layers, different points pop up on the map. And if you select a point, it gives you more information about that specific location. We will go into further detail about how these data layers go into the food cycle and recommend for improvements within that. Starting with production, we collected data on producers, agricultural farms, and aquaculture regions on Nantucket. This is our producers map. If you click on a point, for example, Moore's End Farm, you get various information such as a name, address, phone number, emails, etc. There's all kinds of information listed. We identified 47 producers on the island. In particular, we pointed out 16 agricultural farms. As you can see, these farms are located away from the downtown area, which is where most of the food consumption occurs. This means that in order for restaurants to use this locally produced food, there is an added effort of transportation to get the food from the farmers to the stores. In addition, Food Rescue Nantucket is an organization on the island that transports excess food from farms, restaurants, and grocery stores to various locations like the food pantry. To enhance their outreach and increase the amount of visits they can make, it would be helpful to use this map to help identify areas where they can visit and hopefully reduce the amount of food waste from the island. Aquaculture is another portion of the food production on the island. From an interview with Jeff Carlson from the Natural Resources Department, we learned a lot of good information about these regions. There is about 100 acres of land reserved for aquaculture on the island, and these are occupied by private and town growers by lease, and these leases are renewed every 3 years to make sure that the sites remain active. In particular, there are unoccupied leases in Pulpus Harbor, and we have 2 recommendations for the use of these areas. One would be to advertise them to current growers so that they can know to expand their work into these regions so that all the sites are being used. Or another option would be using it as an educational program, similar to Sustainable Nantucket's Community Farm Institute, where each grower is given a small portion of land to start practicing techniques. This could be done with these open plots and sectioned off so that new growers could learn aquaculture techniques in practice. Either of these options would help in the expansion of aquaculture for the island and also increase food production. Now that the food is produced, it must be distributed. So we identified 43 on-island distributors and 13 off-island distributors, with more off-island distributors to be identified. On island, these are scattered, it's shown in the top right picture, and they're scattered around the island, mostly concentrated in the downtown area, which are the small grocery and convenience stores. Off-island, the large distribution facilities range from New Jersey to New Hampshire, with mostly concentrated in Massachusetts. These off-island distributors provide the island with the majority of the food that is on the island, and they get the food here by the Steamship Authority ferries. And this can present a challenge when there are high winds or storms and the ferries get canceled and therefore interrupt the island's main food supply. In addition, we mapped out 16 storage locations across the island. These include freezers, refrigerators, food pantry locations, food pantry and food rescue drop-off locations. And these are valuable assets to the Nantucket food system because they provide food-focused organizations places to store their perishable foods. There are not a lot of locations with the refrigerator or freezer capabilities on the island, so it would be beneficial for them to try to expand these locations and increase the amount of perishables that can be stored on the island. All of these components can be summed up, and we made this diagram to try and represent that. The arrows show where food flows throughout the system, and as you can see, it's a pretty complicated looking diagram. So we would recommend instituting and expanding a local food hub. This would give a place to centralize all those components you saw in the last diagram. A local food hub is a place where production, distribution, and exchange of food can happen. The first step in doing this would be to get Sustainable Nantucket, the Nantucket Food Pantry, and Food Rescue Nantucket together to discuss what one on Nantucket would look like specifically. And the Sustainable Nantucket has had one the past few years on a smaller scale, and this would be a great way to start the expansion. It would help to alleviate the food storage issues on the island and also increase the face-to-face communication between the consumers, producers, and chefs. So looking at the diagram, there's the distributors who'd be bringing food to the island to sell and also be taking the food off island to sell also. The contributors are the farmers and producers who'd be bringing their food to sell at the food hub. The receivers are like the food pantry who'd be receiving donations. Food services would be visiting the local food hub to buy the locally sourced food and bring it back to their kitchens to sell, for example, in restaurants. And then the consumers are any everyday people that can go and buy locally produced food. And now Rachel can tell you more about the consumption part of the food cycle.
Thank you, Caitlin. The next part of the food system cycle is consumption. The map on the screen right now has two data layers for consumption. It has restaurants as well as hotels and inns who provide food. The restaurants are indicated by the purple dots, and the hotels and inns are indicated by the black dots. As most of them are located in or around the downtown area, we've enlarged a section of it in the upper left-hand corner to more clearly depict that. And on this map, there are commercial kitchens as well as caterers indicated by red tacks and yellow flags respectively. As you can tell from these two maps, most of these locations are in or around the downtown area. And as Caitlin previously discussed, many of the producers are located farther away from these. This makes sourcing locally from restaurants very hard for them. It requires either the producer to bring food to the restaurants, or it requires the restaurants to go pick up food from the producers and bring it back, neither one of which is ideal. This is another reason why the local food hub could help to streamline this process and increase local sourcing. Sustainable Nantucket has the Nantucket Grown brand that they have started to award to restaurants who source locally. This certification has 3 different levels: gold, silver, and bronze. As you can tell from the chart, there are 14 gold, 10 silver, and 6 bronze. While this is great that there are 30 restaurants, this still means that there's 129 restaurants that they could hopefully work with in the future to help promote more local sourcing. The Nantucket Food Pantry is currently only able to accept prepackaged food with an ingredients label. This is due to the fact that they don't have access to a commercial kitchen. Access to a commercial kitchen would allow them to repackage and redistribute food. This would allow them to accept a lot more donations, such as food from restaurants who are closing down for the season. We recommend that in order to expand to this, they partner with the Nantucket Health Department, as well as any interested local commercial kitchens, to obtain licensing to use vacant local commercial kitchens. And we also recommend that they create a schedule with any interested kitchens of their open and close dates so they can have a better understanding of their availability. The next step in the comprehensive food system assessment would be to see where people buy their food. This would likely be done through the use of an online survey sent to consumers, whether this be they buy their food in store or online. We recommend that in this survey, they include a component about donating food online. This is due to the fact that there doesn't seem to be much online food donation, and they could reach a greater portion of the public through this. And the last step in the food system cycle is waste. As you can see from the map here, there's only one waste disposal facility on the island right now. It's the landfill, and it has a registered compost location as well. In our restaurant survey we sent out, we included a component about composting. Many of the restaurants who responded to it indicated positively that they would be interested in this. Of the restaurants who said that they would be willing to compost but did not currently, they cited reasons such as smell or lack of space as their main deterrents. The high school is currently partnering with Sustainable Nantucket and Food Rescue Nantucket to implement a composting program at the high school. We recommend that they use these survey results as a starting point of other stakeholders to invite. It would be beneficial to all in this process. It would alleviate all the concerns that restaurants have of composting on their own land, as well as it would help to grow the program, and it would reduce waste going into the landfill. Jonathan's now going to explain some of our other recommendations.
Thank you, Rachel. Sustainable Nantucket Food Pantry and Food Rescue Nantucket currently have program in place to help them achieve their goal. However, those programs can be improved and new programs can be implemented. The first program we'll discuss today is the gleaning program. Gleaning is the process of recovering excess food after the initial harvest. Food Rescue Nantucket currently glean at 2 farms, Moorhens Farm and Ballard Farms. Although contact have been made with other farms on the island, we recommend that they reach out to them again at the beginning of the next season. The map could act as a database for potential new areas to glean, and with example of Ballard's Farm and Moorhen Farms, hopefully the other farms would be more open to work with Food Rescue Nantucket. The second program we'll discuss today is the Share Your Harvest program. This program allows local farmers and gardeners to donate excess food to the food pantry. The food pantry can better promote this program in order to attract new donors and inspire individuals to create additional backyard gardens. The program currently relies on people donating food and does not include a gleaning initiative. Therefore, we recommend that the food pantry and Food Rescue Nantucket partner together in order to increase donation. We recommend that the food pantry work with the local library in order to implement a Food for Fine program. This program would allow library members to drop off cans of goods in exchange for any overdue fees at the library. Many libraries, such as the WPI library, have already implemented such a program. And as you can see, in 2014, over 171 cans of food was collected worth over $650. And just last year, over 900 cans of food was collected worth over $3,000. And all those food were donated to food pantries in the Worcester area. A Food for Fine program on Nantucket would increase the presence of the food pantry in the community. To keep this project going and to keep the map up to date, we have established a program between the high school and the three organizations. This program is not only a great opportunity for the high school student involved, but also for the organization, since they have limited resources in order to keep this map up to date. The students involved in this project are from the Sustainability Club and Technology Club in the high school, and this will give them a great opportunity to learn about the food system cycle of Nantucket. So to help them, to guide them through this process, we've created a user manual on how to update the map. As you can see here, this is a page of our manual on how to upload parcel data onto ArcGIS Online. Alongside the text, we provide pictures to help the student through the process. The student will also have access to this database, and they will be able to update it and add new information. And they'll also be able to add new data layers into this database. And as the database is updated, they will be able to keep this map up to date for the three organizations. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And I'd like to thank our sponsored organization, Yeshi Palmo from Sustainable Nantucket, and Marie from Nantucket Food Pantry, and Gary from Food Rescue Nantucket. We'd also like to thank Nantucket High School, Dan Farrell, Jed William, and all the high school students for participating in this project. And we'd like to thank the local restaurant owners who participated in survey and interviews. We'd like to give a special thank to Young Bicycle Shop for providing us with bicycle to use on the island, and Maria Mitchell for providing us with housing, and Nantucket Shipwreck Life-Saving Museum and Remain Nantucket for their welcoming on the island. And we'd like to give a special thank to our advisors for guiding us through the project. Thank you. We are now open to questions.
Questions or comments? Yes. Yeah. Well, this is all being recorded, and if you want to be on local access TV, you need to use the microphone.
So, what do the restaurants have to do to reach the various levels of the program? You had silver, bronze, silver, and gold.
There are different percentages of the food that they need to source in order to reach these levels. So to be bronze certified, I believe you need to source 5 to 15%. Silver, you need to source about 16 to 29%. And gold, you should source about 30+%.
Yeah, I was intrigued by your idea of the local food hub. I was trying to figure out, though, if I was a distributor, why would I want to participate in something like this? Would I see this as maybe opening up my customers to competition?
One of the things would be such as like connecting Bartlett's Farm to Stop and Shop or something like that. Grocery stores and convenience stores are always willing to have that local food and get that local food. that they can sell to consumers.
I was thinking more the people who come from Off Island, I don't know the name of the truck, you see Rainer or something, and they're supplying restaurants. Why would he want to participate in food?
He could bring local food from the mainland onto the island as well. So it could be local food from all kinds of different sources.
Any other questions? Mike?
It was an interesting statistic, the value and the library fines for fees and the value of the cans. Did anybody think to track the fines that were forgiven?
Typically, if you have a book that's past its due time, you get charged couple of cents, and as time go by, that money kind of add up to a couple of dollars. Me personally, I have an overdue fines right now of like $15 at the library.
One can of food and you're free.
Well, thank you very much, team. So as you may know, WPI has a network of these centers around the world, and every one of these centers depends upon the work year-round and year after year of what we call the center director. And I'd like to thank my colleague Dominic Golding for the work that he's been doing for the last 8 years to make this such a vibrant center. So, and a pleasure to work with you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. It's a pleasure, as always, to come to Nantucket. I'm glad to come this time with Rick Vaz. We've had a good time meeting with all of you. I think the students have done a tremendous job. We've been very impressed by all the work that they've done. We like these projects, obviously, to be a good educational experience for the students. We also like the projects to be, contributing to the community. So trying to devise projects that meet those two goals is really my aim as a centre director. I think the students gave lots of call outs to the various people who've helped us on island. There's probably some that we're missing. Bill Dovos gave us a wonderful party for the students the other night, and Eric and Pam Goddard have now started what appears to be an annual chili dinner over at their house, which is always a great occasion that the students love. Students always seem to love free food. So once again, thank you very much for joining us today. Eric.
What is the adoption rate of suggestions globally on these programs? I thought it was very interesting. His response was, it seems to be Nantucket is the one that adopts most of the suggestions compared to any other location. Bravo. What a resource for us.
Yeah, one of the reasons we love coming to Nantucket, sorry, Gary, you can't scurry off yet. One of the reasons we love to come to Nantucket is it's an island community. You're always very welcoming. I also run the project centre in London. It's another island, but it's a lot bigger, and the City of London is pretty big. The ability that we have to get to know people, the ability, the willingness that people on Nantucket have in talking to the students, whatever their bizarre questions might be, is just something that's very difficult to replicate anywhere else in the world. So I think having that access and it being an island community, we're able to have more impact than we would be in somewhere like a big metropolitan area like London. And we'll certainly be sure to send you all a notification about that party. It'll probably be July and August time next year, which will be our 10th anniversary. So thanks again for joining us. Appreciate it.